Hello and welcome to the lecture on childhood. Today we will be talking about what is childhood, what is it for, what might be some adaptive value for childhood, and also how did it evolve, because childhood is a unique part of the human life cycle, and only humans have this stage in their life cycle called childhood. Now, a lot of researchers have argued that it's just a stretching out of either the infant phase or the juvenile phase, but what it really looks like is a totally unique phase of the life cycle that's been inserted in between the juvenile period and infancy. So that's our definition for childhood, this phase of development occurring between infancy and juvenile period. And during this time, children are physically independent, so they're able to walk and travel and crawl and get around on their own, but they still need to be fed. And other species like chimpanzees don't have this difference. By the time that infants are physically independent, they're also capable of feeding themselves, and I mean totally physically independent, not just playing away from mom every now and then. And this time period varies a lot in its definition. Many evolutionary biologists classify it as the time between the end of the first year and 6 years of age, and this is thought of as early to middle childhood for child development researchers. Some people consider it to be between the ages of 4 and 7. For policy purposes, UNICEF classifies it as the time period between birth and 15, but they have a vested interest in trying to help as many young people as possible. But for the sake of simplicity, we're just going to be considering it from roughly 1 until, I would say, anywhere from 6 to 8 to 10 years old. It doesn't really matter that much. And as I said, other primates move from infancy to juveniles without this period of feeding dependency. So we see here the life cycle of macaques, gibbons, chimpanzees, and humans laid out, and you'll notice several interesting things about it. First of all, humans live much longer than the other species. Also, we have a very long post-reproductive period, which we'll talk about in later lectures. We also have, as you can see at the bottom, childhood. So the hatch marks that look like forward slashes there, just above the black bars, which are the prenatal period, are listed as infancy. Now, of course, we don't consider humans infants up until about 7 years of age, and that's what's reflected in this stretch of infancy, or this insertion of childhood here, where kids are mobile and independent, but still not capable of feeding themselves. So feel free to stop these slides at any time if you want to take a look at graphs for longer, or take notes and bring questions in, and I'm happy to answer questions or discuss more of this material when we meet in class next week. And before we go on, I wanted to mention also that this period of childhood is quite flexible in terms of its length, which is probably why it's so difficult to classify the age length of childhood, because under stressful or demanding circumstances, childhood can be shortened quite a bit as kids can become independent earlier, or we can stretch childhood longer as we allow children to be dependent for longer periods of time. Now we're going to talk about a variety of reasons of why humans need a childhood or have a childhood, and one of the immediate answers is that we just are born very undeveloped. Our young are extremely altricial, and so you can see here a picture of a human baby unable to hold its own head up until about 2 months after birth, compared to the baby zebra over here who's up and walking about while the placenta is still attached to mom. So our young need a long period of development, not only because they're born so underdeveloped, but also because they have a long way to go. A lot of growth occurs after birth, as the difference between the size of an infant and the size of a full-grown adult is so very different. We're also developing complex systems like a very large brain, and that takes a lot of calories and a lot of support. So you can see here some evidence of baby food in I believe this is a Hadza child in East Africa versus baby foods in the US, because infants aren't even born with their teeth developed. And we also, compared to other species, develop extremely slowly. So this is enamel formation time versus thickness, and the steeper the slope, so the further to the left it is, the faster the development, and the further to the right it is, the slower the development. And you can see several species here in different colors and different panels. So in the upper left we see humans, Homo sapiens, compared to African apes and proconsul. In the upper right we see humans, African apes, early Homos, and Neanderthals. And in the lower left we see that humans, African apes, compared to Australopithecines. And we can sum it up here in the bottom right corner, and you can see the difference here between Australopithecines and even early Homo species and Homo sapiens. And because we're lower, we have a slower, it takes more time to develop the same amount of enamel thickness. So we develop very slowly compared to other species. And not only do we develop slowly, but a lot of this development takes place away from mom. So if you look at body size at weaning, for orangutans and chimpanzees, they've, I don't know what the sextupled in size from birth to weaning. So they've increased their body size their weight at least 6 times since birth. And all of this was dependent on lactation from mom. Humans, on the other hand, are only twice their birth weight at weaning. So not only are we weaned relatively early, and I'll show you a picture in the next slide, but our slow dependency is not fueled by lactation. So we'll get to this towards the end of the lecture as how are we funding this very slow development, and if it's not by lactation, how are others possibly helping mom? Oh, and I'll get to weaning sizes, weaning rates later too. So what is childhood for? A lot of different things are occurring during this 6 to 8 year period, depending on how you count it. A lot of growth is occurring, somatic growth, growth of the body. A lot of brain development and growth is occurring. A lot of practice dealing with complex social networks, language, and culture, and also possibly work, as older kids are semi-useful, and they both gain practice doing everyday tasks as well as they're able to help out around the house. So here's just an example of a growth chart of how the CDC expects growth to progress from the age of 2 to the age of 20. And this is for boys, and you can see growth is in height is tailing off around the age of 16, and weight is tailing off around the age of 20. But these periods from 2 to 13, we see a lot of steep growth, and especially the growth is occurring between 8 and 13, which means that they're not growing as fast as they could between the ages of 2 and 8, at least especially when it comes to weight. And this might be because they're busy doing other things during this time, which I'll get to in a second. We also see different growth patterns by sex. So we see here boys versus girls, and if you look at overall height, you can see that girls reach their average height around the age of between 13 and 15. And boys don't reach their average height until around the age of 17. So girls grow faster during this growth spurt shortly after puberty, but they also reach their adult height earlier. And you can see that reflected in these 2 different growth spurts on the left. The girls' growth spurt occurs earlier. The boys' growth spurt is more extreme and occurs later. And of course, we see some sexual dimorphism with males having an average higher height. And of course, all of this is not occurring uniformly. Different systems are growing at different rates. We see especially a lot of head and brain growth occurring in the first 10 years. And then during the juvenile and adolescent phase, so after puberty, we especially see a lot of height and weight acquisition. And we also know that different systems grow differently. So children are born without teeth. We see the dentition come in. We see the milk teeth fall out and a new set of dentition come in. And we see dentition coming in at different rates. So the incisors and the canines tend to come in first, and then the molars later, and we don't even get our third premolar developing until around the age of 18. I'm sorry, the third molar, not premolar. We're not New World monkeys. So just a little information about what's going on during brain development. Almost all of the neurons in the brain are present at birth, but what's occurring is you're building connections during childhood. So these glial cells that are connecting the neurons are growing and connecting to all the different brain cells. And brain weight for body weight peaks at about 20, but brain growth is especially rapid during the first 7 years. And during this period of growth, we see a variety of sensitive periods for different body systems. So adult height and weight can be affected by diet in childhood, especially early childhood. So if children are chronically malnourished, we see stunting occurring, so they'll have shorter adult heights overall. A lack of macronutrients like calcium also can affect adult stature. And if you're not getting enough calcium during the growth of the long bones during childhood, you will see a condition called rickets, where the bones are not properly ossified, so they're softer, so putting the body weight on the bones causes this bowing of the legs and sometimes also a deformation of the pelvis. During childhood, humans are also setting up responses to stressful situations. So kids in chronically stressful situations or have traumatically stressful situations occurring during their lives, we often see abnormal cortisol responses later on in adulthood. So kids either aren't responding to stressful situations or they're responding more strongly than usual. And language acquisition is also occurring during this time. And if kids are prevented from learning language, and there's been several documented cases of kids being shut away by their parents essentially and not allowed human contact, like this little Russian girl on the left here, if they do not have human contact before puberty, they have very, very greatly decreased language skills as adults. And the longer these children go without language contact, the more and more difficult it is for them to acquire language later on in life. But, you know, as important as growth is, some people have estimated that possibly, 90 to 95% of child development is growth-free. We did see that decreased weight gain in early childhood, and possibly because kids are doing a really important thing during this time period, and that is they're learning culture. And you see two examples of boys here helping their grandfathers out. On the left, this is a Chimane boy watching his grandfather make fishing arrows, and on the right, we see a Jinakaruba boy helping his grandfather set up for a ritualistic ceremony in India. And during childhood, kids are practically soaking up culture all around them. They're learning how to interact with others, everyday patterns of subsistence, how to make jokes, language, religion, kinship patterns, and all of that stuff that we learned from other people. And it's very important for human children to learn culture because culture is so adaptive. Culture allows us to quickly find new strategies in new environments, or if our current environment changes. And culture is also fantastically helpful because it's a cumulative body of knowledge that individuals can acquire through social learning, and then they themselves later in life often can improve upon it by individual learning. And so by the time that you inherit a sea hunting domain of cultural knowledge that allows you to hunt seals with an atlatl from your kayak in the north, you've got this fantastically adaptive body of knowledge that others who've come before you have helped to build, that you wouldn't be able to acquire on your own. So we have a whole series of lectures later on about why culture is so adaptive, but it does appear that one of the most beneficial aspects of having a childhood is that you have this long period for social learning. Now, the big question is, where did culture come from? Well, some people have hypothesized that with human group sizes being as large as they are, if we were to try to maintain social bonds by grooming each other, it would take 42% of our time to groom everyone that we need to maintain a relationship with. And so a lot of people have thought that language and culture, and language especially, culture is highly dependent on language, is just more efficient than grooming. But you're also developing a lot of other types of knowledge, skills, values, and beliefs by learning culture. It's not just getting along with other people, it's also how we extract resources from our environment. So kids during childhood are learning things like gender roles, and I always love these pictures like my chore charts where you can see it's very clearly structured of what types of things the girls are doing versus the boys. Community power structures are very important for kids to acquire during this time. Kinship patterns, complex subsistence practices, how to get resources out of your environment, but also myth, religion, history, and much more things. And a lot of what's occurring during childhood is play. So here's where that energy is going. Instead of weight gain and increased gain in stature, kids are expending a lot of energy in play. They're interacting with one another, and they're interacting with other kids of different ages, figuring out how the social system works, figuring out how their bodies are going to interact with the environment, and figuring out the types of skills that they'll need later on. And it's fun for them. A lot of kids love doing the things that adults do, practicing sweeping or playing at cooking, throwing things and wrestling. Children are motivated by enjoyment to play and practice the types of activities that are going to be important later on to them. And another of the unique aspects of human development that occurs during early childhood, so we're talking between 2 and 4 years of age, is the development of self-awareness. So if you give a lot of other animals a mirror, they'll see another animal in the mirror, and they won't understand that it's themselves. And there's a few species who are the exception to the rule. Humans, elephants, dolphins, and chimpanzees are somewhat good at this as well. So you're not only developing the concept of self and the fact that you are an agent in the world, you're also developing a theory of mind. And a theory of mind is when you can attribute mental states to other people that are different from your own. Or I'll read the text directly. Attributing mental states that are different from your own to other people. And this is essentially the ability to understand that other people have different thoughts and beliefs and values and motivations from yourself. And this is quite unique among species. So here's a comic joking that our theory of mind ability allows us to essentially read the thought bubbles going on in other people's heads. And we see a theory of mind coming online really around 4 years of age. Children between 3 and 4 are developing a theory of mind. Before that, kids have a really hard time doing things like lying because they assume, well, as far as we can, know what toddlers are thinking, it seems that they assume that the thoughts in other people's heads are the same as their own. So they're unable to hide things because they assume that other people will know where they hid them. At least hide things on purpose. And we can test that with a simple test that we give to kids, and we see them being able to solve this test, as I said, starting around the age of 4. And it's called the Sally Ann test. And here's what you do. You tell the child stories. Here's Sally. Sally has a basket, and here's Ann. Ann has a box. Sally has a marble, and she puts the marble into her basket, and then she goes out for a walk. While she's gone, so she's out of the room, Ann takes the marble out of the basket and puts it into the box. Now Sally come back. She wants to play with her marble. Where will she look? If you ask 3-year-olds this, they'll say she'll look in the box because they don't have a theory of mind, which means they don't understand that because Sally was out of the room, she may not know, well, as they saw the whole thing unfold, and they do know, so they don't understand that Sally has a different perspective from their own. Once kids reach about age of 4, they'll say, well, Sally will look in the basket because that's where she left it. And she has a different thought process than me and different from Ann, and she's been out of the room, so how could she know that Ann moves the marble? And this seemingly simple but actually quite difficult mental feat to understand that other people have different thoughts from your own is very important for cultural acquisition. It means that you essentially know that other people know things that you don't, possibly very valuable things like how to find food. And therefore, if you could acquire their thoughts somehow, you could gain their knowledge and also gain their abilities like finding food. There's some evidence that Down syndrome kids can solve this problem at the same age time period as non-Down syndrome kids, but there is evidence that children with autism take longer to reach the developmental stage where they can solve this problem. And of course, an important component to theory of mind is language development. So during childhood, we're seeing a lot of language acquisition occurring. 1 to 2 years old, we've got a small vocabulary and telegraphic speech. Want, shoe, cookie, no is a popular word. And between 3 and 5 years old, kids are really starting to get this phonological awareness, developing local dialects, starting to form simple sentences, and refining their grammar. So my nephew is at the stage where he's saying things like, "I did it jumping," and as he gets older, he'll be able to say things like, "I jumped." And finally, between 6 and 10 years old, we see kids really starting to deal with complex sentences, multiple meanings of words, and they're also just learning an incredible amount of vocabulary during this time. And language is important not just for communicating wants and needs, warnings, and other information about the environment, but it's also a crucial component in culture. And we see language very wrapped up in cultural expression and perception of the world. So on the left you see a chart of words like war, peace, corporate, hippie, hot, cold. And anthropologists went around to different cultures and asked them, especially where the word was applicable, so you could say corporate in every culture, what color they would associate with that word. And so war, you see a lot of black and gray and red. A lot of red is associated with hot, and blue is associated with cold. But you also see a lot of variation between each word. So safe, for example, is, every color of the rainbow is represented. As if I ask you what is the color of safe in different cultures, you get a large variety of responses. So language helps us perceive the world along cultural lines. It also helps us engage in all of those symbolic and ritualistic activities that require a nuanced understanding. So if you think of things like art and artistic expression, or music, if you listen to another culture's music, oftentimes a lot of people don't like, if they're raised in the U.S., East Asian music especially, or Indian music, as I heard a lot of it on the bus when I was there, sounds especially discordant to their ears. But it's because a lot of this early cultural training in terms of what's beautiful, what's valued, a lot of these are tied up in cultural learning, and a lot of these are tied up in language learning as well. So besides social development, gaining culture, gaining language, kids also do a variety of other things during childhood, and one of those things is work. So we do put our kids to work, giving them simple chores. In the U.S., helping clean the house or tidy away their toys. But in a variety of cultures, kids are put to use carrying water or helping during the agricultural system, keeping an eye on fires, often simple tasks that are appropriate for their strength and coordination levels. Because this long period of development means that it takes a lot more effort on the parents' part to raise the kids. So any offset that they can do is really useful. In places where it makes sense to invest in kids, we see formal education becoming important as well. Formal education is oftentimes important in stratified societies, as there are non-subsistence related tasks that adults can do, children who will become adults one day can do, that require specialized training such as reading and writing. And the track that kids take is often dependent on parental expectations, especially how likely your kid is to survive. So in places where infant mortality is high, we see parents concerned with the health and the survival of their kids, and there's little investment in learning and training. And this is because across species we see that adult mortality rates are tied to length of development. So if adult mortality is low, we see less investment in development, and especially if physical care can make a difference, we see more investment in physical care. And in places where infant mortality is low and adult mortality is low, parents are less worried about children's health, obviously, and they know that it makes more sense to invest in skills because there is this expectation that there's going to be a long adult period in which those skills are going to be put to use. Now, something that's been examined recently is the role of kids in childcare. So we know that around the world, kids are often involved in the care of other kids. So even things like babysitting, we see teenagers looking after younger children, but even kids as young as 4 or 5 might be in charge of looking after their younger brothers and sisters in a lot of places. And this draws us into the question of how did childhood evolve? Now, remember those pictures of chimpanzee body size at weaning versus human body size at weaning, and it makes a lot more sense when you look at this type of graph. What we're seeing here is the age in months at which the infant is weaned. So for lemurs, it's about a year and a half, capuchins about 2 years, baboons a little less than 2 years, chimpanzees around 5.5, and orangutans closer to 7. And humans are kind of the unique outlier here, especially compared to the other apes, because we wean so early, and that's partially why body size is so small. But it has serious consequences for the interbirth interval. And what we know about humans is that compared to other apes, they have much shorter interbirth intervals. Now remember, we talked about lactational amenorrhea. So chimps and orangutans nursing for 5 to 7 years aren't getting pregnant during that time. Humans, decreasing that to 1, 2, 3 years, can quickly get pregnant again. And what that means is that while chimps and orangutans have sequential births, humans have stacked births where we have multiple dependent offspring attached to one mother or one family at a time. But just because they're weaned doesn't mean they're food independent. That's the definition of childhood. And so we see a lot of allocare occurring here. Allocare by care by people other than the mother. So we'll talk about some relatives who tend to care more in a few slides. But because people other than the mother can help out at least feeding the infant, this decreases the infant dependency on mom, decreases the interbirth intervals. But that leads to another problem down the line. So let's just think about what's going on with stacked births. Here's the amount of resources required to support the child, and here's time. And so we see with just one child, over time we see feeding dependency peaking during childhood as kids are big, requiring a lot of calories and also not able to feed themselves. But what happens when you have a younger sibling? Well, now you've got another mouth to feed on top of that. And what happens if you have another sibling? You've got another mouth to feed. So the amount of resources is cumulative as you have multiple dependent offspring due to these stacked sequential births. And it's really hard for parents to do this alone. And this is a graph showing you the amount of time it takes to provision all of these children. So you see at the bottom, dad is spending 8 hours a day in production to support himself and the kids. Mom is spending another 8 hours a day supporting herself and the kids. But it's not enough. After the first child is born, we see this problem with the stacked sequential births. As you increase from having your first child, second, third, last child, you increase the amount of production that's needed and the amount of time that you need to invest in getting all of those resources and childcare and other activities done. And this leads to what we call a parental deficit. And in fact, this can be quite large, especially as you have all of these kids approaching the juvenile period, right around where the first child leaves. This is when this peaks. And this is a big deficit. Mom and dad can't solve this on their own. So without some sort of allocare, it would be very difficult for humans to take advantage of shortening the interbirth interval, decreasing dependency on mom through lactation, and increasing the number of kids you can have in your life. So they're obviously getting help from somewhere. So these are graphs of the net calories a day given to, on the left, kids, so the age of the mom and the dad, and the amount of calories they're giving to their kids. As you can see here, after about the age of 20, when they're starting to have their first children, we see this increase in the amount of calories they're providing to their children. And as the kids leave the house, a decrease occurs as the parents age. And on the right is just the net from the parents to the kids at the age of the kids. And you can see the peak here between 0 and 15. as the kids become self-sufficient after that. But you can see here that the childhood dependency peaks right around the age of 10. We'll talk about what's going on. So I forgot to say, blue is boys, green is girls. We'll talk about the net from the parents, what's going on, why is there a second peak for girls around the age of 25. I'm sure you can think of a good reason. We'll talk about that more specifically later on. But we can also, we can also talk about the other types of people who have an interest in the survival of the kids, and one of those is the grandparents. So grandparents are giving a lot of calories to grandkids. You can see this peak here around the age of 65. That's when their own children are reproducing, and their grandkids are in need of meeting this parental deficit. And we can see on the right how much calories kids are getting from their grandparents. We see this peak again around the age of 10, and also, especially for girls, in the 20s and 30s, if the grandparent is still alive. So grandparents are important contributors to meeting this parental deficit. The other category of people who are really important are the children themselves. So this graph is showing you out of the total amount of household production, who's contributing. So if you look at the 0, it's only mothers and fathers contributing, and that's at marriage. So this graph is years since onset of marriage. So when the mom and the dad get married in this society, this is from the Maya, mom and dad are the only contributors. They have some kids. Around the age of 8 to 10, we start seeing young children becoming a contributor to household production a little bit. They might be finding some food on their own or helping with care of younger children during this time period. As they become juveniles and become more self-sufficient, so the juvenile period is feeding independency, but not yet reproductively active. So these kids are helping out a lot around the house, and as they become older and move into their own adulthood and reproduction, they become net producers. So other children in the household can take up to 50% of the burden off mom and dad as they develop through their independency. And this data comes from Karen Kramer, who also wants to remind us that it's not just calories, but it's time. Watching children can take a lot of time, and so if it's as simple as telling your 8-year-old child, hey, keep an eye on the baby while I go get water or I collect firewood, this can seriously remove the burden from mom and from dad. So both in terms of becoming feeding independent as well as taking some of the time burden off rearing younger children, older sibs can seriously help out around the house and help mom support all of those stacked births. So to sum up the hypothesis here, the evolution of childhood came about because provisioning by kin allows for stacked births and a longer developmental period. So parents are increasing both their quality of children by having this long developmental period, which supports a lot of social learning, and they're also increasing the quantity of children they're having by being able to shorten the interbirth interval. Childhood is so valuable because it allows time for brain development and cultural acquisition. So once we see this new developmental period appearing, it also quickly becomes very, very useful. And older sibs may be especially important for raising younger sibs. And we'll talk about the importance of other kin, like grandmothers and grandfathers, as we reach that age in the human life cycle. So that's it for today. I hope you understand a little bit more about the evolutionary theory behind childhood, and I look forward to seeing you next time for maturation.